energy on set was incredible. I didn't actually work with any stuntmen on the set.
We would love to. We just need the leads. So anybody out there, if you've got any leads for us, you can email us, you can call us.
Frank Fritz, I will make you silent forever. The cold threat echoed in the final moments of the fateful 13-minute phone call between Mike Wolfe and his close friend Frank. Today, the television empire of American Pickers has collapsed, dragging with it a bitter life sentence for Mike Wolfe. The deadly fentanyl poison found in Frank's body marked the end of Mike's life behind the cold bars of prison. But what was truly revealed in that final call? What words drove a friendship that seemed unbreakable to the brink of destruction? Was Mike Wolfe truly a cold-blooded murderer? Or are there darker secrets hidden behind the glow of this famous television show? Join us as we unravel this mystery, traversing a journey full of ups and downs from the heights of fame, where two friends conquered the hearts of millions of viewers, to the depths of betrayal and crime in the story of the American Pickers stars. One perfect mask of American Pickers. Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe were once the perfect duo on-screen companions on a journey across the United States, seeking hidden treasures in abandoned farms and dusty garages. They brought life to forgotten stories, offering viewers simple moments, natural conversations, and a deep love for history. However, behind these emotional scenes, a completely different story unfolded with simmering jealousy, unexpected acts of betrayal, subtle manipulation, and a covert power struggle that ended in a breakdown. So how beautiful was their friendship before its tragic end? It all began with an old truck, a vintage camera, and two young men full of passion for exploration. This was the time before they were famous, before millions of Americans knew them, tuning in each week to watch them haggle over old items like rusty signs or ancient gas pumps. Mike Wolfe and Frank Fritz were just two regular men from the Midwest with calloused hands and a shared dream. Mike Wolfe was well known in Iowa for his unique skill. He could knock on your door and ask if he could rummage through your garage. He had an exceptional ability to recognize the hidden value in things that most people considered junk, from broken bicycles, old jukeboxes, to faded billboards. Mike had an eye for detail, not only seeing the item itself, but also recognizing the history and stories behind it. Frank, on the other hand, took a different path. He worked as a fire inspector, a stable job with good benefits, but his heart didn't truly belong to it. He spent his weekends hunting for old items, visiting flea markets, thrift stores, and estate sales. Although they shared the same passion for treasure hunting, like Mike, Frank was more reserved and less extroverted. He didn't haggle for profit, but for the satisfaction of making a good deal. He had a unique charm and a down-to-earth sense of humor that made people trust him easily. Despite their many differences, their combination was undeniable. Their friendship naturally grew over the years, connected by a shared philosophy. One person's trash could be another person's treasure. In the early 2000s, they began collaborating on unofficial road trips, just the two of them, with a map marked with scribbled directions and an open road ahead. Though they weren't famous yet, they had already built a reputation in the local collecting community. They called themselves Pickers. This wasn't an official term, but for those in the know, it meant recognizing the value in forgotten, dusty, and overlooked items. They recorded everything, from photos, notebooks, to short family videos, shot with a handheld camera. Mike, with his forward-thinking vision, started to think bigger. He wondered, why not turn this into a show? Reality TV in the early 2000s was very different. A show about two guys buying antiques didn't promise much of an audience. However, Mike didn't give up on his idea. They created an engaging sizzle reel, funded it themselves, and began pitching it to TV networks. Dozens of networks rejected them, saying the show was too slow and lacked conflict. But then, a call came from the History Channel, which was looking for a show that was both educational and entertaining. Mike's video caught their attention, and a deal was signed. The show would follow Mike and Frank as they hunted for rare items and untold stories. Mike insisted that Frank be a part of the show. At first, the show didn't believe Frank was a good fit. He wasn't polished, he wasn't an actor, and he didn't care about acting. But Mike believed Frank was essential, that he represented the ordinary person. In the end, the show agreed, and American Pickers was born. The show debuted on January 18, 2010, and didn't make an immediate splash, but a loyal audience began to grow fond of it because of its rare authenticity. American Pickers gave the impression that Mike and Frank were truly friends, their friendship not scripted, but as real as the antiques they uncovered. Viewers loved the interactions between them, Mike's quick-witted remarks, his attention to detail, and Frank's humorous style. By the second season, the show had found its rhythm, and the viewership grew. Broadcast deals were signed, and a series of spin-offs followed. Mike and Frank became minor celebrities, recognized at airports, asked for autographs at gas stations, and welcomed at antique shops across the country. However, as the show became more popular, the demand for filming increased. The schedule became more exhausting, and the episodes required more drama to capture viewers' attention. The simple trips with friends slowly transformed into a real job. Despite this, Mike and Frank still tried to hold on to some of the initial magic. They still hit the road together, laughing over coffee at roadside diners and debating the value of old items. Fans noticed this. They weren't just tuning in to see antiques, but to witness the genuine friendship between the two. Danielle Colby joined the show as a key character. She managed the antique archaeology shop in Iowa, playing an important role in the trips by coordinating logistics and finding leads. Danielle brought a punk rock charm, a contrast to Mike's polish and Frank's simplicity. The energy of this trio brought tremendous success. This was a show that was friendly and approachable, yet never condescending to its audience. Every item had a story, and every story had value. After the show's success, Mike Wolfe expanded the antique archaeology brand, opening a second shop in Nashville, writing books, launching a clothing line, and becoming a representative for the world of antiques. In contrast, Frank cared little for the spotlight. He preferred quiet pleasures, restoring antiques, riding his motorcycle, playing with cats, and exploring lesser-known flea markets. While the differences between them became more apparent, Mike remained ambitious with goals beyond the show. Frank was content being a part of something special. However, even as cracks began to appear, their friendship still maintained its solid exterior. They still teased each other in front of the cameras and shared beers after long days of filming. Although tensions grew, they didn't let the audience see the cracks, at least not until the early 2010s. American Pickers became one of the flagship shows on the History Channel, airing in multiple countries and inspiring other programs. Mike and Frank appeared on magazine covers, joined talk shows, won awards, and attended events celebrating American culture. Their journey had gone from being two guys mocked for their picking hobby to embarking on a memorable adventure. However, this story didn't last forever. Beneath the happy facade, a storm was brewing. Changes in Mike Wolfe's career slowly caused their friendship to unravel. 2. The final call and silent cracks. The moments that the audience is unaware of on the show. American Pickers are the stories that happen when the cameras stop rolling. Late-night arguments, simmering anger that has never been resolved. The gradual and irreparable distance between two men who were once inseparable. With each passing season, the divide between Fritz and Mike Wolfe grew deeper. The small cracks at the beginning developed into deep ravines invisible through the lens, but as clear as day to those working behind the scenes, the significant change only truly occurred when the viewership exploded, and insiders later revealed that in Season 10, Mike Wolfe began to become more authoritarian in shaping the direction of the show. Assistants were constantly changing due to the overwhelming pressure of the job. It was no longer just about the stuff a former crew member said on condition of anonymity, it was about Mike. And Frank was slowly being pushed out. It wasn't an outright removal, but a gradual decline. Fewer lines, less screen time. The tension between the two men was cleverly masked by forced laughter and upbeat background music. Those involved began to notice the first signs of the rift. Crew members recalled that the tension between Frank and Mike was mounting. They often drove separately, ate separately, and sometimes refused to shoot together unless absolutely necessary. The occasional sarcastic remarks during filming still made it into the final cut as jokes, but the implied meanings were impossible to miss. A former production assistant described the situation bluntly. There was an unspoken tension. It felt like everyone was walking on eggshells. Mike increasingly became more commanding during shoots, while Frank seemed visibly frustrated. Mike even told the director that he wanted to fire Frank immediately. Frank's screen time continued to decrease, and when fans began asking why they were given vague explanations involving scheduling or health issues. However, the truth was much more complicated. By that point, Mike Wolfe wasn't just leading the show, he also held complete control over all its operations. Danielle Colby, who had always been in the middle of the two men, tried to maintain peace. She had been close to both from the beginning and had witnessed the change happening day by day. "We used to be three," she once shared with a mutual friend. "Now it feels like it's just Mike's show." There was one particularly memorable moment never aired but deeply etched in the crew's memories, marking the beginning of the split. The team was filming in Tennessee to check out a vintage motorcycle collection. When Mike and Frank inspected a rare Harley-Davidson, Frank pointed out a restoration flaw. Mike ignored it. Frank continued to express his concern, suggesting it could affect the resale value. Mike didn't raise his voice but responded sharply enough to silence the entire crew. Frank left the set, and the cameras stopped rolling. It was just another crack in a relationship that was increasingly beyond repair. When Frank confronted the producers about the incident, they reassured him that everything was fine, that he was still a beloved fan favorite, and would not be fired. However, the signs of trouble were clearer than ever. Behind the scenes, Mike began consulting legal experts on how to take full control of the show's creative direction. At that point, both he and Frank were equal partners in several intellectual properties related to the show. However, one clause in their agreement stated that any contract violation, such as extended absence or substance abuse, could void the offending party's share. Though it was a technical issue, it seemed that Mike Wolfe was preparing to exploit it. However, health issues and a battle with depression began to take a severe toll on Frank Fritz. Ultimately, Frank left American Pickers abruptly. In a statement, the show cited health reasons. However, according to close sources, Mike had suggested that Frank had voluntarily left. Not only did Mike allow him to go, but it seemed he had erased him from the story altogether. This was why Frank called Mike on that fateful night. In the weeks leading up to his death, Frank became more withdrawn. He stopped responding to texts and missed doctor's appointments. In fact, Frank was preparing an important legal document, his will, in which he specified that Mike Wolfe would not be entitled to any of his assets or image after his death. And that was when things began to unravel. On that Thursday evening, Frank called Mike Wolfe. The call lasted less than 13 minutes. At that point, Frank was furious and anxious. "I've kept silent for years," he said. "I covered for you when Danielle almost left the show. I said nothing when the network threatened to cancel the show because of what happened in South Carolina. I've always stood by you, even though I shouldn't have. And now you want to pretend like I never existed. Data shows." There was a long pause of about 6 seconds before Mike spoke. When he did, his voice remained controlled. "You're making a mistake," he said. Frank wasn't intimidated. He responded directly. "You've always thought you're the star, but the truth is you're nothing without me, without Danielle, without us. You built your throne on the people who trusted you, and now I'm going to destroy it." Mike's response remains a subject of controversy, as he ended the call abruptly, saying one last thing before hanging up. "You did this to yourself." Less than 90 minutes after the call ended, Frank Fritz collapsed. The neighbor found him the next morning motionless on the living room floor, still clutching the TV remote. There was no sign of forced entry, no suicide note, just a man lying still with fentanyl in his system. Medical records showed Frank had never been prescribed this drug, and there was no history of fentanyl overdose. The confirmed dose of the poison was fatal, but no pills or patches were found at the scene. The biggest question remains how the deadly poison entered his body, which remains one of the biggest mysteries in this case, raising confusion in the community. Initially, Frank Fritz's death was only seen as a sad story of declining health rumors of addiction and the end of a reality TV star's career. But gradually, the anomalies began to emerge, causing many to become suspicious. Why did Mike Wolfe hastily issue an emotional memorial statement when Frank was still being kept alive? And why did Mike hire a team of lawyers to reclaim the rights and challenge Frank's will immediately after his death? These unspoken questions have sparked a wave of doubt, making many shudder at the potential secrets hidden behind Frank Fritz's sudden death. 3. A stroke or a murderous plot. On a warm afternoon, the first official reports began to emerge. Frank Fritz, who had once partnered with Mike Wolfe on the show American Pickers, had suffered a severe stroke. As soon as news of Frank's death began to spread, Mike Wolfe shared a message on social media. Keep him in your heart and thoughts. According to the official statement, Frank was found slumped on the living room floor, still holding the TV remote with the screen still on. Subsequent reports about the presence of toxins made the story more complex. During the autopsy, it was revealed that Frank's blood contained a lethal amount of fentanyl. Not a therapeutic dose, but a high intentional dose capable of causing respiratory failure and cardiac arrest. What was surprising, however, was that there were no signs Frank had ever abused drugs before. Investigators initially struggled to explain the presence of fentanyl. There were no drugs, no patches, no syringes, and no evidence of a drug distribution system. Frank's home was impeccably tidy. The security system he had installed just months before was also disconnected, the day before he was found. That 48-hour period seemed to have been mysteriously erased. However, the police quickly realized the prime suspect was Frank Fritz's closest friend, Mike Wolfe. The first clue came in the days after Frank's death, when Mike repeatedly posted tributes, participated in interviews, and portrayed himself as a grieving friend keeping his spirits up. But behind these public gestures, a meticulously planned scheme was unfolding. Mike was reportedly in touch with his legal team just an hour after Frank was hospitalized. Immediately, Mike filed legal documents to change the licensing rights for the American Pickers brand while quietly removing Frank's name and image from several key contracts. All actions that were taken before Frank officially passed away. When these discoveries were made public, Mike denied any involvement. However, for the investigators, these were the motivations they needed to overcome their initial doubts and begin building the case. A case that still required careful investigation because there was no clear evidence as to how the fentanyl entered Frank's system. Mike's setup was nearly perfect. A victim who had suffered a stroke living alone with a history of medical issues and mental health problems. It was easy to assume Frank's death was a tragic end to a life filled with struggles. But the traces he left behind, emails, voice memos, documents, told a different story. One of betrayal, shattered secrets, and a man who once called Frank his brother. As the investigation continued, authorities discovered that Frank's primary laptop had gone missing. His mobile phone had also been wiped clean, restored to factory settings. No apps, no call history, no photos. This was a major red flag. No one who has a stroke in an emergency situation would reset their phone just hours after their death. The reset occurred at 2:41 a.m., nearly 6 hours after Frank was last known to have communicated. Who did this? Why forensic technology experts were brought in to recover any remaining data from the storage devices. What they found only deepened the suspicion that the reset had been done remotely through a private IP address registered to a media company in Los Angeles, a company that coincidentally had a contract with Mike Wolfe's production team. The investigation also revealed that Frank had recently backed up several folders to his personal cloud account. When investigators accessed this backup, they found dozens of documents, emails, and voice memos revealing a terrifying story of betrayal and an impending lawsuit. Among these documents were draft emails Frank had sent to his lawyer. One email written just 2 days before his death stated, "I want to officially terminate all obligations related to Mike Wolfe. He's acting unfairly, and I have reason to believe my personal image is being used without permission. I am willing to testify if needed." This email was never sent. Another folder contained voice memos recordings that Frank had left as reminders or documentation. In one, he said, "If something happens to me, check the 2009 contracts. There's a clause Mike doesn't want anyone to see. He's been hiding it for years." Additionally, there was a screen recording, a video with Frank's voice reading a legal memo. "I helped build this brand. I will not be erased just because Mike wants to act like it was his idea. He manipulates people. He's covering his tracks, and I'm not going to protect him anymore." One of the most striking pieces of digital evidence was a series of draft emails that were never sent but were saved in Frank's outbox. One email began, "You know I'm the funny guy on American Pickers, but you don't know the truth. Mike Wolfe has lied to you, and now I'm ready to tell the truth." All of this information was recorded, time-stamped, and clearly had never been sent. Phone calls and disposable numbers connected to Mike's legal and public relations team were also found. And then there was a Dropbox folder titled Insurance. Inside were copies of contracts, personal notes, and a folder named Danielle Truth. This folder contained a detailed account of an incident involving Danielle Colby and Mike Wolfe during the early seasons of the show. Although the details are kept under wraps for court purposes, the severity of this information was enough to hint at misconduct that Frank had concealed for years. In the end, Frank's calls became the clearest motive for the prosecution. This was not a death from a natural drug overdose, but rather an attempt by Mike Wolfe to eliminate his close friend, the one person who had decided to speak out. 4. A life sentence verdict. The case of the trial of the century for Michael Wolfe officially kicked off on a gloomy morning, and from the very beginning there was a heavy atmosphere. The courtroom was packed mostly with reporters, former crew members, executives, and spectators from all over. Some came out of curiosity, some out of a thirst for justice, and many wanted to find answers to the questions that had haunted them ever since Frank Fritz was found slumped on the living room floor. The prosecutor started with a brief yet sharp statement. "This is not an accident. This is not an overdose. This is a calculated silence from a man who knew too much but refused to remain silent." The jury listened intently as she laid out the details of the case: deleted files, tampered devices, digital traces, attempts to alter contracts, and ownership issues in the days leading up to Frank's death. However, the final phone call, the conversation between Frank and Mike, was the irrefutable evidence. Mike Wolfe's lawyer did not deny the existence of the recording, nor did he dispute the conversation between Frank and Mike. However, he argued, "Sure, Mike seems upset, but anger is not the reason, and being accused does not mean there is proof." He even implied that Frank had been dealing with mental health issues in the time leading up to his death, making erratic decisions, cutting off communication with family and friends, and possibly even abusing drugs himself. However, the prosecution was well prepared. They had summoned a series of expert witnesses, security analysts, medical examiners, and contract law specialists. Each one contributed a piece to the puzzle that surrounded Mike Wolfe. Digital forensics experts confirmed that Frank's phone had been remotely wiped via an authentication linked to a device in Mike's home office. The server that had once stored backup footage from Frank's security cameras had been accessed from an IP address associated with Mike's production company. A medical expert from the Iowa State Forensic Laboratory testified that the amount of fentanyl in Frank's system could not have been obtained orally. "This is the result of an injection," the doctor said. "You cannot have this amount of fentanyl from oral ingestion. It must have been intravenously or intramuscularly injected." At this point, Mike sat quietly in his seat, jaw clenched, eyes staring straight ahead. The prosecutor continued by calling several former production staff, most of whom had never publicly spoken since the show reached its peak. They described Mike's tight control over decisions, his opposition to creative ideas, his obsession with ownership, and his efforts to undermine Frank's significance. A former editor testified that Mike had demanded that an entire episode be re-edited to reduce Frank's screen time, saying, "Focus on the brand. I don't care if Frank is in it." In her testimony, Danielle described the early days of American Pickers as incredibly happy. The show was very real and everything was genuine. They were a team, and the core of that team was trust, especially between her and Frank. "Frank was always there for me," she shared. "When things started going bad, he was the one who warned me to be careful." She explained that this bad situation began in the third season of the show. She admitted to a major incident involving Mike Wolfe, including harassment, coercion, and a lawsuit threat that the show had tried to cover up. "Frank was the only one who stood up for me," she said. "He defended me when no one else would, and I think he paid the price for it." According to Danielle, things began to subtly change. Mike took more control over production decisions, rewriting filming schedules, and removing changes that were not approved in her contract. She was no longer involved in important creative discussions. When she asked for explanations, she was shut out or told that she was no longer part of the team. Danielle did not take the issue to the press or file an official complaint. Why? She shared that she feared losing her job, afraid of being labeled as difficult in an industry that was unwelcoming to women who spoke up. But Frank knew. "He was the first person I told," she said, "and he believed me. I will fix this." Frank said, "Just don't let him scare you." As the seasons passed, the tension between Mike and the remaining team members grew more apparent. Danielle recalled times when Mike distanced himself from everyone traveling alone and issuing orders through producers instead of communicating directly with anyone. On one occasion in Missouri, Mike allegedly refused to appear on camera with Frank unless the script had been pre-approved. Danielle had to step in to smooth things over. "Frank was really tired, but he stayed because he didn't want to leave me alone." She recalled that in Frank's final weeks, he repeatedly called her, leaving anxious and regretful messages, sending emails. One of the last emails read, "I should have protected you better, and now I'm the next one." Danielle said she cried when she read that message. She knew something was wrong, but by the time she drove to see Frank, it was too late. When she arrived at Frank's house after his death, everything had been cleaned out. She stood at the door, looking through the dark windows, whispering, "I'm sorry I'm late." But it was the final witness of the week who left the most significant mark: Frank's lawyer. She testified that just 3 days before his death, Frank had sent her a revised version of his will, removing Mike Wolfe from any benefits from his estate. Notably, Frank also included a sworn affidavit accusing Mike of misconduct, assassination, and stealing intellectual property. This affidavit was time-stamped, verified, and admissible in court. "This is not delusion," the lawyer said. "This is a death preparation that was anticipated." The jury deliberated for 3 days and finally reached a verdict: guilty. Mike Wolfe was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. When the sentence was announced, he showed no emotion. He simply remained silent, his face cold and blank as if defeated. Outside the courthouse, a crowd gathered, and one man held up a sign reading, "Frank found the past." Mike tried to bury it, but the truth always survives. When the trial ended, justice seemed to have been served. Mike Wolfe was convicted, and Frank Fritz was no longer a name tainted by scandal, but a victim who had been vindicated. However, as Mike was led out of the courtroom in chains, another battle was quietly beginning. Not for criminal justice, but for ownership of identity profit, and who had the legal right to benefit from the man whose death had shaken the world. The battle for Frank Fritz's legacy had officially begun. The contracts that Frank had signed during the peak of American Pickers still showed Mike Wolfe as a co-owner of the show's merchandise and branding. Millions of dollars from television royalties, merchandise, and even from the books that Frank had written all flowed into Mike's pocket. Behind the glamour of the show, it resembled a financial whirlwind. Frank's father, Thomas Fritz, who had been quietly working behind the scenes to restore his son's reputation, filed a lawsuit on behalf of Frank's legacy. He sought to permanently prevent the use or exploitation of anything bearing Frank's name or likeness, supported by a team of top intellectual property lawyers. However, the battle was far from over. The History Channel, which had remained silent throughout the proceedings, finally issued a statement acknowledging its role in the ongoing story. "We at History deeply regret the events surrounding American Pickers. We take full responsibility for the pain caused to the Fritz family and the public. Effective immediately, all reruns featuring Mike Wolfe will be suspended." In an effort to rebuild trust, the History Channel began working on a documentary about Frank's life, his contributions to the show, and his years dedicated to preserving forgotten American history, titled The Heart of the Hunt, a Frank Fritz story. Frank's legacy is incredibly important, his father shared. "We want to remember him not for the way he passed, but for how he lived with curiosity, loyalty, and a sense of wonder." Meanwhile, fans across the country began organizing memorial events. Antique shops dedicated entire sections to Frank's favorite items. Community centers hosted screenings of his most iconic episodes. Social media was flooded with tributes, along with clips of Frank negotiating deals, telling jokes, and reminding everyone that history is not just about objects, but about the people. Frank's legacy, once at risk of being stolen, has now been reclaimed and cherished. The Frank Fritz lawsuit, one of the darkest chapters in reality television history, finally came to a close with a fitting sentence for Mike Wolfe, who had once been Frank's close friend on screen. Justice, though delayed and painful, was ultimately served. Yet amid the verdicts and tearful goodbyes, one question still lingers. One secret remains hidden. The truth about Danielle Colby. The woman who witnessed everything from the inside is still buried under layers of time and carefully guarded testimonies from the private hearings. So what details are still concealed behind the veil of secrecy? Which testimonies were overlooked due to legal reasons? What truths were too painful to be spoken in a courtroom filled with lawyers and cameras? To stay updated on every twist and turn in this gripping and dramatic story, like the video, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to get the latest videos about the Frank Fritz case.